Morning. The subcommittee will come to order. I'd like to thank you all for being here. Before my statement, Ms. Gilligan, I'd like you to think about possibly making some comments to us. We're all very concerned about some of the situations around the world and the decisions that the FAA made, especially in respect to suspending for 24 hours the flights into Israel. And if you could give us a little bit of an update after my statement and Mr. Larson's statement about how the FAA is looking at this and what we may see in the future and how you come to make a decision like that. So, again, I thank everyone for being here. The American aviation manufacturing is a critical sector of our nation's economy, contributing billions of dollars and supporting millions of jobs annually. We are the world leader in aviation safety, standards, and manufacturing, delivering thousands of aircraft components and systems worldwide every year. Today, this subcommittee will look at the state of domestic aviation manufacturing and some of the challenges that it faces. Since recently encountering a hit during the economic downturn, our aviation manufacturing sector has seen positive growth, and key economic indicators support this. We in Congress want this vital component of the aviation sector to succeed and surpass where it was prior to 2008. However, despite the industry's success, manufacturers continue to face some challenges as they work to bring products to the market. All aircraft components, and aviation systems which operate are manufactured in the United States. Must meet specific design and operational certification standards set by the Federal Aviation Administration. The role that the FAA plays is absolutely critical and necessary to ensure our standards continue to be the gold standard and provide for the safest air system in the world. As manufacturers designed and build to meet these standards, they can experience delays in approval both internationally and domestically. These delays can result in the loss of real dollars and jobs for our aviation manufacturing sector, and we've had some very specific instances that have pointed to that, which concern us a great deal. The previous FAA reauthorization bill required the FAA to develop and implement plans to address inefficiencies and inconsistencies in the certification process. Currently, the FAA, along with industry, is working to implement these plans in a cooperative fashion. We look forward to hearing what progress is being made on this front. In regard to aviation certification, the FAA is truly the gold standard across the world. As the aviation industry continues to push technological boundaries, it is important that the FAA certification processes also adapt to accommodate for this innovation. Furthermore, as American manufacturers compete in a global market, it is vital that the FAA leadership is recognized and maintained globally, and we in Congress do all that we can to help ensure that it stays that way and true. In addition to an effective and efficient certification process, the manufacturing industry relies upon a dedicated and well-trained aerospace workforce. Today, we will hear from a witness who can speak directly to some of the important work that is being done to respond to the need for innovation and skilled aerospace workforce. In my own district, Atlantic Cape Community College has recognized the need for a well-trained workforce in the growing industry of unmanned aerial systems. Under the leadership of College President Peter Mora, they are currently working to develop a curriculum that will bring the next generation of an already technologically savvy youth into this growing industry. In addition, I have the privilege of representing the FAA's Tech Center, which is the premier FAA facility in the nation for research and development and for safety and security. Through their important research, experts at the Tech Center assist manufacturers as they work to bring innovative products to the market. For instance, CSC and dozens of other companies utilize the expertise of Tech Center employees and laboratories as they develop their innovative technologies. I'm interested in hearing what role the government can play to promote the aviation manufacturing industry's success. It is key we listen to the input of those in the real world and what they have to offer to us. Today, we are fortunate to have a company who has been part of America's aviation manufacturing industry since the Bright brothers first took flight, and who can speak to the day in and day out complexities of the industry and the challenges they face. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses on these topics and thank them for joining us. Before I recognize Mr. Larson, I'd like to ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous material for the record. Without objection, so ordered. Now I'd like to recognize Mr. Larson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for calling today's hearing to discuss domestic aviation manufacturing. U.S. aviation is vital to our economy. Domestic aviation manufacturing, the reason we're here today, is one of the major reasons why the aviation industry in this country is such a powerful economic engine. In 2012, U.S. aviation manufacturing generated a total output of over $150 billion. This topic obviously is close to home for me. In my home state of Washington, about 650 aerospace companies support as many as 209,000 jobs. These companies range from Boeing to the many small businesses that are a critical part of the aviation supply chain. Aerospace is the state's largest exporting sector, accounting for over 40% of the state's exports in 2011. The issue we're exploring today are the ones we have explored before, and I want to thank Chairman Lobiando for remaining focused on them. Last October, we had a subcommittee hearing about FAA's certification process, where we discussed opportunities to make these processes more efficient and to bring more consistency to FAA's interpretations of regulations. I look forward to an update today about the FAA's progress from that hearing. The predictable and timely certification of aircraft and aircraft components is critical for domestic manufacturers to get their products to market. We must also ensure FAA does not cut corners so it continues its critical mission of ensuring the highest level of safety. The FAA reauthorization enacted in 2012 included 2 provisions directing the agency to conduct an assessment of the aircraft certification and approval process, Section 312, and addressing FAA's personnel's inconsistent regulatory interpretation, Section 313. As we continue to conduct our oversight of FAA's implementation, I hope to learn more today about the progress FAA has made in these areas and where the agency's efforts have stalled. Specifically, I hope to hear about how the labor unions and affected FAA inspectors and engineers have played a part in FAA's efforts and if they have signed on to the agency's certification reform efforts. Labor involvement is critical. FAA leadership can say one thing, but the people doing the day-to-day work need to buy in before moving forward with major changes. We also have to work to be sure FAA has adequate staffing resources to do the job and to keep pace with new technology. For example, I understand the workload of FAA's 204 manufacturing inspectors continues to increase while the size of this inspector workforce does not. And there's no question that FAA must streamline the process under its Organization Designation Authorization, or ODA, program because of growing workload and limited resources. But we must continue at all times to ensure that certification efforts are subject to thorough and proper oversight so that the high level of safety the FAA maintains is not compromised. Another common theme I continue to hear from manufacturers is that our neighbors abroad are unnecessarily delaying their validations of FAA-certified products. We must make sure that other countries do not question FAA's gold standard so that our manufacturers remain competitive in an increasingly crowded global market. More broadly, we must do all we can to avoid disadvantaging U.S. manufacturers as they compete vigorously with foreign manufacturers. To this end, last year, Chairman Lobiando and I asked GAO to explore the FAA's certification process in the U.S. as it compares with those of its counterparts around the world, and I look forward to reviewing that report when it's issued later this year. Global competitive depends on having a robust pipeline of well-trained and highly skilled workers. And the Government Industry Panel convened in 2010 by then Secretary of Transportation LaHood recommended several measures to improve the training and development of the nation's aerospace workforce. To speak to this issue, I want to extend a special welcome to Dave Cox of the Air Washington Project. Dave is on a later panel. The Air Washington Project is a unique consortium of community colleges that are working together for the sole purpose of training and educating workers in a wide variety of aviation jobs, such as aircraft maintenance, manufacturing, and assembly. In Washington State, we've made investments in the people that will keep our manufacturing base strong, and I look forward to Mr. Cox sharing those lessons with the panel. So, Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you for holding this hearing. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses. And if I may, Mr. Chairman, just perhaps ask unanimous consent. It's a little bit of a surprise that Ms. Gilligan's comments on the FAA's decision with regards to air travel not be included in her 5 minutes, so she can brief us on that. Yeah.
Yeah, that was not intended for you to be in your 5 minutes. Good point, Mr. Larson.
Thank you.
And we have Ms. Peggy Gilligan, Associate Administrator for the Aviation Safety at Federal Aviation Administration. And if you could give us some comments on this crisis we're seeing around the world, and then get into your statement after that, please.
Certainly, Mr. Chairman. First, let me just make a small comment on the Ukraine. As you know,
can you pull your mic a little closer, please?
Sure. As you know, there is an international effort underway to secure the site of the crash of the Malaysia Flight 17. FAA does not have technical experts in Kiev at this time. The NTS, National Transportation Safety Board, has sent an expert, and we remain ready to support any investigation once, if necessary, once the site is secured. That airspace over eastern Ukraine continues to be closed to all operators because the Ukrainians have actually closed that airspace. As to yesterday's initiative, as you might imagine, this is a very fluid situation. We are in close contact, the FAA is in close contact with the Civil Aviation Authority in Israel. We initiated the action after it was confirmed that there had been a rocket attack that occurred within just beyond a mile from the airport. Obviously, our mission is to assure the protection of our operators and the passengers on those operations, and it was determined that it was, and the appropriate action was to close access to Ben Gurion Airport for U.S. operators for a 24-hour period. And we continue to monitor the situation. The administrator has been, again, in close contact with his own counterparts, with the State Department, with the U.S. Embassy in Israel. And we will monitor the situation and make a determination before 12:15 this afternoon, which is the 24-hour period for the original notice to airmen concerning the airport. We've also been in close contact with our operators, the airlines, U.S. airlines that operate into Ben Gurion. There was a United aircraft on the ground after the NOTAM took effect. We did authorize that aircraft to be moved from there. As you know, most of the other aircraft that were in flight diverted and did not continue their flights into Israel. That continues to be the situation at this point.
Okay. Thank you. Now, if you proceed to your statement.
Thank you again, Mr. Chairman, Congressman Larson, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before the subcommittee to discuss the FAA's role in supporting domestic aviation manufacturing. Through our high safety standards, rigorous certification processes, and strong collaboration with industry stakeholders, the FAA operates the most complex and the safest airspace system in the world. Civil aviation manufacturing is vital to the U.S. economy. Last year, civil aviation supported 11.8 million jobs, accounted for $1.5 trillion in total economic activity, and contributed 5.4% to the U.S. GDP. Civil aircraft manufacturing represents a top U.S. net export. Between 2009 and 2012, the growth in new civilian commercial aircraft sales in both domestic and overseas markets averaged 9.2% per year, outpacing the overall U.S. economic growth. That underlies the fact that people around the world buy and rely on U.S. aviation products because the FAA sets the gold standard for aircraft design and manufacture. For more than 50 years, FAA has certified all civil aviation aircraft, aircraft engines, propellers, and parts that operate in the U.S. airspace. FAA has played a key role in the safe operation and growth of the aviation industry. The FAA oversees the life cycle of an aircraft, from design and manufacture to the operation and maintenance of the aircraft once it enters service. As the aviation industry continues to grow, it is incumbent upon us to improve our processes and make them as efficient and effective as possible while maintaining the highest safety standards. The FAA Modernization and Reform Act of 2012 contained a provision, Section 312, that required the FAA to work with industry representatives and to develop recommendations to reform the aircraft certification process. The FAA and industry agreed on 6 recommendations that we believe will streamline and re-engineer the certification processes. FAA developed an implementation plan that mapped the recommendations to 14 agency initiatives. Since the original release of the implementation plan in January of 2013, we have made progress on all of the initiatives. And to assure transparency on our progress, we post an update on the FAA website every 6 months. The next update will be published by the end of this month. FAA encourages and facilitates the growth of U.S. aviation manufacturers, both domestically and internationally. We continue to authorize expansion of production facilities in the U.S. and ensure that we have sufficient resources to oversee domestic manufacturing. We have bilateral aviation safety agreements with over 47 countries, including an agreement with the European Union that covers 28 nations in Europe. These agreements allow U.S. manufacturers to export their products and expand their business all around the globe. The agreements also allow aircraft and components produced in other countries to be imported for use in U.S. products. But products manufactured in other countries must still meet FAA safety standards to operate in the U.S. We ensure the safety of all civil aviation components and aircraft that operate in our airspace wherever they are produced. Bilateral agreements also allow foreign manufacturers to establish production facilities in the U.S., which creates additional jobs and stimulates local economies. FAA recently issued a U.S. production certificate to Embraer to establish a manufacturing facility in Florida. Airbus also recently opened a manufacturing facility in Mobile, Alabama, through an extension of its European production approval. In this era of growing technological sophistication and globalization, we collaborate with our industry partners to more efficiently oversee the certification and production process. We use a risk-based approach to improve aviation safety by focusing our resources on the areas of highest risk. And to leverage our workforce, we use the designee system, which was established by Congress in 1938 and is critical to the success and effectiveness of the certification process. The designee program plays a critical role in our ability to efficiently certify the wide range of aviation products designed and manufactured in the U.S. There are currently over 600 engineers in the Aircraft Certification Service and over 200 inspectors. But we have over 5,000 individual designees and over 80 organizational designations. Without the designee program, we could not complete the volume of work we have today or in the future. Assuring that we have a robust and successful delegation system is imperative to the continued growth of domestic aviation. Aviation is a constantly evolving industry, and our certification process must evolve with that industry. We know that we cannot remain static. We continue to work with our industry partners to foster innovation and economic development so the United States will remain the global leader in aerospace. Mr. Chairman, that concludes my testimony for today. I look forward to answering any questions.
We thank you very much. Next, we're pleased to welcome back Dr. Gerald Dillingham, Director of Civil Aviation Issues for the United States Government Accountability Office. Dr. Dillingham, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Larson, Chairman Schuster, members of the subcommittee. We've conducted several reviews examining the efficiency of FAA's aircraft certification and approval processes and industry's concerns about inconsistent regulatory interpretation. FAA has implemented several initiatives to address these long-standing issues, but they do persist. As the ranking member noted, Congress established requirements in Section 312 and 313 of the 2012 FAA Reauthorization Act to spur additional actions on these items. In response to those requirements, FAA chartered two rulemaking committees, one on the aircraft certification process and another on the consistency of regulatory interpretation. Both committees produced a series of recommendations to assist FAA in addressing these issues. My statement today focuses on one, FAA's progress in implementing the certification process and regulatory consistency recommendations, and two, the challenges affecting successful implementation and how they might be addressed. Regarding the certification process recommendations, FAA has established 14 initiatives to address these recommendations. These initiatives include developing a comprehensive roadmap for major change initiative, improving the project sequencing process, and updating the aircraft certification regulation. Most of these initiatives are scheduled to be completed within the next 3 years. However, FAA has established performance metrics for only 5 of the 14 initiatives and has not developed metrics to measure the overall effectiveness of the collective efforts. These metrics are essential in helping FAA and the industry determine whether these initiatives are leading to improvements. Moreover, Although several initiatives are said to be on track, we are concerned that FAA expects to miss interim milestones for two of the most critical recommendations due to concerns raised by the unions representing inspectors and engineers. Missing these milestones increases the risk of delays in scheduled implementation of the initiatives. Turning to regulatory consistency recommendations, FAA has begun implementing these recommendations. In its July 2013 report to Congress, FAA included a preliminary plan for implementing these recommendations. FAA has indicated that its final plan would include an implementation strategy, assign responsibilities to individuals and offices, and establish milestones and measures of effectiveness. The plan is now projected to be completed next month, which is about 8 months beyond the initial target date. Looking ahead to potential implementation challenges, FAA will likely be under increased pressure to establish more efficient processes as new aircraft materials, aircraft types, and next-gen avionics are introduced into the national airspace system. FAA could significantly increase its chances of improving its processes and successfully adapting to changes in the industry by working to address some key challenges. Specifically, FAA should focus on 1, identifying the necessary resources to sustain these efforts when faced with fiscal pressures. 2, making the cultural shift required to implement a risk-based approach in making certification and approval decisions. This shift necessitates buy-in, support, and accountability throughout the agency, from the highest FAA management levels to the designees and safety inspectors in the field. Additionally, FAA must ensure early and continuous involvement of industry stakeholders and establish and use performance metrics that measure outcomes rather than outputs to help show what is actually being achieved through these initiatives and to hold those responsible for implementation accountable for the results. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This concludes my statement.
Thank you very much. Dr. Dillingham, you covered a lot of territory there. I'm trying to sort of digest some of that. Pretty concerning. But can you sum up what you would say are the biggest challenges the FAA faces in implementation and recommendations related to Section 312 and 313 of the Modernization and Reform Act?
Yes, sir, Mr. Chairman. I think the recommendations that the two ARCs produced are basically a roadmap to making significant improvements in both the regulatory interpretation issues as well as the approval issues. I think, leave aside, assuming that the resources are available, because it will take some resources to implement all of the things that FAA has on its plate. But a major issue is the cultural change that's involved in this. FAA is moving from the way it used to do business, where you had a more hands-on approach, to where they're using risk-based safety management system kinds of principles that it's different for the inspectors, different for the designees, and that cultural change takes time, and it's very, very, it's a tough thing to do. But I think, implementation of the recommendations is the first step to be consistent with implementing those recommendations over time.
So when you talked about the FAA possibly missing these key milestones, what effect would these delays have? What's the downside to this?
I want to be clear that the issues that were raised by NATCA and PASS either have been resolved or are being resolved with collaborative discussions between FAA and the unions. But when FAA set their initial milestones, they set them without knowledge that they were going to take some discussions with those two unions. So the idea is that if, in fact, FAA does miss the milestones or those interim milestones, the final completion date may be expanded as well. But again, those issues have been worked and are continuing to be worked with the two unions.
Okay. Thank you. Ms. Gilligan, the aviation manufacturing industry is constantly innovating and growing. What steps has the FAA taken to ensure that the certification process is able to respond to such innovation and growth while maintaining safety? And I'm asking this question because Mr. Larson and I have heard from some stakeholders where they are very concerned that the FAA is not keeping pace with what the real-world industry needs, and it's potentially costing us jobs and downturn in economic activity.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, we've certainly heard those same concerns, that the industry, as I noted in my testimony, and we are all well aware, the aviation industry in the U.S. is a very innovative industry. They're always looking for ways that they can improve their products, and we work with them hand in hand in being able to support that. So there are a couple ways that we approach staying up with that. First, on the technical side, obviously our standards aren't prepared to address every new innovation that comes along, and so we have a process in place that allows our manufacturers to innovate and to document a way, working with FAA, to document a way that their new whatever it is, will be able to be safely introduced into the system. So we've always been mindful that we don't want our regulations to be a hindrance to innovation, because innovation tends to improve safety. New concepts tend to enhance safety. So we do have a technical way of being able to do that. So as we move toward composites, as they bring in new avionics systems or whatever it might be, we have a process to document with the applicant what is the safety standard that will need to be met and how they will go about demonstrating that they can actually meet it. So technically, I think we're ready to do that. I think the bigger concern is, as has been highlighted in some of these recommendations, that and as Dr. Dillingham highlighted, we need to look differently at the work we do. We need to think differently about what it is FAA's role and what is the role of the manufacturer. And I think these recommendations and the plan that we have to implement the changes under Section 312 recognize that. So as you've highlighted, we do have a new plan for how we will sequence new applications. We are working with our unions to finalize that, but it is a tool that will allow our workforce to evaluate what is the safety value of this new product. How widely does it affect the system? And because those are important things. We want to get safety products in. We want to get in changes that affect the larger part of the system. So it will give our employees a way to prioritize the work with nominal timeframes for when they then should take certain actions. In addition, we always enter agreements with our applicants, with the manufacturer. When they bring us a new product, we and they agree to a schedule. They tell us when they're going to present information or tests or data, and we tell them when we will be able to review that and return it. And we hold each other accountable to those schedules. So we've learned that the better planning we can do up front, along with the manufacturer, the more successful we and they can be at managing those projects. So we're approaching it, I think, from a number of ways to just try to continually be more efficient.
And Mr. Larson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can you discuss a little bit about the inspectors' workload increasing beyond their headcount, especially as it relates to managing the demand for that oversight while accelerating the use of ODAs? Can you put it in that context? And then maybe outside of that context as well.
No, I think that's exactly the context. So again, as I said, this industry is very innovative, and the federal workforce and the resources that we have will always be limited. I appreciate Dr. Dillingham putting aside the question of resources, but unfortunately we really can't. So given what we know to be the resources we have available, that's why the FAA is turning toward this risk-based approach. We want our employees working on and overseeing those elements of design and manufacture that have the highest safety risk. And we want to use our designees, the thousands of people who have been designated to work on behalf of the administrator, to take care of those more, the more well understood, the more mundane activities that are a regular part of certifying products. We think that that's the right balance. So the approach that we're taking is for our employees to focus on those high-risk elements, things like new applications of composites, for example. That's something we at the FAA want to work with our manufacturers on closely. But the fundamental of physics for flight are very well understood, and approvals of systems and designs that meet those fundamentals can certainly be handled by designees on our behalf.
You mentioned it to Mr. Lobiondo, Chairman Lobiondo, a few examples, but can you just be just even more crystal clear about the specific actions the FAA has taken to provide more clarity on what activities would be delegated, specific activities would be delegated?
Yes, the approach that we are putting in place is for our engineers actually to assume that the project can be delegated, and that then they must really look at what are the high-risk elements, and they must document why it is we, FAA, need to retain certain elements for our own approval. And I think it's, as Dr. Dillingham indicated, it's a different way to think about the process. There are many, many very highly skilled designees throughout the system. They have very much the same training as our engineers, and they are competent to make findings on our behalf. So it's really up to the FAA to determine what are those unique characteristics, those particularly high-risk elements, the new and novel applications where the FAA needs to retain that determination. And other than that, we should allow for designees to make findings on our behalf.
Dr. Dillingham, in your testimony last October, you explained the FAA had not developed performance measures to track the success of improvements that the agency makes in its certification process. Today, you described that continued lack of performance measure as a missed opportunity. Why would you call this a missed opportunity?
Mr. Larson, the reason we called it a missed opportunity, it relates to the adage of, success builds upon success. And a couple of things are associated with that. As FAA moves forward and implements the various recommendations that are associated with approval and certification, and it has some success in improving those processes, that to the extent that the industry is made aware of that, to the extent that FAA can point to with metrics that success is being achieved, that increases the likelihood as FAA moves forward with what could be some more difficult changes along the change management chain. There is the idea that this can happen, this can make a difference, and you're more likely to get industry buy-in when you move towards that risk management, change management that will be necessary to overhaul the whole process.
Yeah, good. That's fine. Thank you very much, and I yield back.
Chairman Schuster, thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lobiondo. I'm confused. The FAA comes before us and says they're moving in a certain direction. Mr. Dillingham tells us that this risk-based approach, for instance, that you're not moving fast enough or you're not moving in that way. Industry tells me that there's no sense of urgency. They see moving towards this, and that's where they want to move to. So, Mr. Dillingham, are they moving to a risk-based approach, or is it just so slow that it's going to take years and years to get there?
They are absolutely moving towards a risk-based approach, not only in this area, but in many other areas that FAA has oversight over. Database, risk management, safety management systems, all those things are the new FAA. I think what you hear and what we hear is that it may not be happening fast enough, or in some cases, what we just talked about a moment ago is that communications can be improved so that industry and others can see that this is going on. And I think it's important to recognize that, and we've said this a number of times and others have said it, that cultural change is not an overnight thing. It's going to take some time. We know it's been some time.
How long? 20 years?
Well, I can't put a date on it, Mr. Chairman, but change is taking place. But as we just said, sometimes it's
well, that's my concern, that we are going to lose our lead in the industry if we don't make these changes. The other thing that I've heard over and over again is the inconsistency throughout the country with the FAA. So people shop the different regions to find somebody that's going to be easier to deal with, not sacrifice safety, but just be able to move through the process. The other thing that I heard just recently, a small rebuild firm, they take small aircraft and they rebuild them. They get it done quicker and cheaper or less expensive in other countries. Now, I can get my head around why Brazil may be faster because they're an emerging economy, or Canada has to deal with a giant right next door to them, so they're nimble and fast. But when they tell me they're taking their planes to Germany because it's easier to deal with, less expensive, more efficient, I can't understand that. Germany is a country that's loaded with regulations, but they're able to do it. So can you talk to me about what you said the FAA is working with our partners, but why would an American firm go to Germany to do a rebuild on a plane when it should be doing it here, right here in America?
Mr. Chairman, I'm not familiar with that example, and if you would, I'd ask that we talk to your staff, because I'd like to look at that one in particular, because we and the Germans have exactly the same standards. We have a bilateral agreement, and through that agreement, they accept when FAA has certified a product, and we accept when the Europeans have certified a product. So it's an example I'm not particularly familiar with, and we'll definitely be glad to look into it and get back to you with what those specifics
right. And
might be.
I'm pretty confident we can get a number of those, but again, if we have the same standards, it has to come down to the process and the people as they apply the standards, it seems to me. And that's something that we have to, again, and I talked about that issue of throughout the United States, I hear that they shop around to the different regions where they know that it's more efficient process. Can you talk about standardization across the FAA regions?
Yes, sir. We also, as you know, from the reauthorization bill, we did have a direction to look at how to improve standardization. The recommendations that came from that committee are really quite all-encompassing, and they're much more robust, much broader than the recommendations that came as it related to aircraft certification process. Standardization is an important initiative, and we've focused on that. And actually, I think we've made good improvements over time. We've put in place opportunities and tools to elevate issues or questions if at a particular field office there's a disagreement between the applicant and our inspector. We have a process in place to elevate that to get an accurate and consistent answer. That can take time, and so we're looking at how we can refine that. The recommendations on improving consistency, the fundamental one is to start with a much broader database that will allow us to integrate all of the information about a particular regulation, for example, so that our inspector or engineer and the industry can go to a single source and find out what is all the information to help them understand how to implement or how to apply that regulation. We have a prototype program that'll be underway in the fall, which I find very exciting. That's new technology has allowed us to find ways that we can search the many databases that we already have to start to address that particular concern. And I think you're going to see us starting to make real headway in some of those initiatives. But it is an issue that is well known to us at the FAA, and that we are constantly working with industry to bring those to our attention. If there's inconsistency, we want to work with them, and we want to get to a single solution.
Well, then I'll just finish up by saying, we really got to move fast on these things, because I have a great concern that we're going to lose our lead in the industry across the board in all the aviation industry, and we need to do things differently. And on my watch, and on Mr. Lobion and Mr. Larson's watch, I don't want to sit here and watch our aviation industry go the way of the textiles and the auto industries and every other industry, that we put these hurdles and these burdens on them that they're not able to move forward and be innovative. So, again, we need to consider things differently. And one of the things I sit here today and think about is maybe it's been customary for as long as I've been in Congress, we always let the administration come up and testify first and the industry go second. I think we need to take into consideration that letting industry go first to help the members here understand the problem, so we can have example after example, so that the administration comes before us and then defends itself and hears these problems firsthand. So that's something we need to take and consider. We need to do a different approach across the board on everything we do when it comes to aviation. And again, we're going to be doing that here in the next months and years. Thank you.
Well, Mr. Chairman, with your permission, this is going to be a big focus of what we do with the reauthorization bill, to try to understand how all this is coming together, and then with very specific language, make sure that we can keep ourselves on the cutting edge of things. So, thank you. Ms. Johnson?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to both of our witnesses for being here. As I've listened to the dialogue, it appears to me that you could easily say that staff and resources and funding necessary to both maintain safety and make these ambitious improvements could be a problem. Has the agency grasped the fact that you might have to do more with less?
Congresswoman, absolutely. We believe, and Congress has always been very supportive of the aviation safety program, and we appreciate that. But we're also realistic, and we read the newspaper, and we know there are pressures on the federal budget. And that's exactly why we're pursuing some of the initiatives that we've been talking about. We want to make sure that our technical experts are focused on those areas of highest risk, and that we at the FAA are overseeing the safety of those programs. And it's important to keep in mind, it really is the manufacturer's responsibility to assure that they are designing and building a safe product. It's the airline operator's responsibility to provide safe transportation. The role for FAA is to set the standards that allow them to do that, and then make sure that they're meeting those standards. And we believe that we can manage our resources to effectively continue to build on our safety mission. I think our record is clear. We're very good at what we do now, and we intend to maintain that.
Are you current with the reports that you're supposed to send to Congress on your progress?
Yes, ma'am. I believe at this point we are. The follow-up reports are not required to be submitted to Congress. That's why we're posting them on our website so that we and the industry can track our progress. But as the reports related to certification, I believe, have been properly submitted.
Well, what would you consider your major handicap right now in trying to get up to par?
Well, I think the challenges are, as we've been discussing, bringing all of our workforce along on this change is something that, as leaders, we are required to do. But as Dr. Dillingham has suggested, it is a challenge. Employees are comfortable doing work as they've done it in the past and as they understand it, and it's up to us to make sure they're properly trained and have the tools ready to be able to make these changes. We believe we're putting those kinds of tools and training in place, and that, in fact, the employees, our engineers and inspectors, will be able to focus on those higher risk areas and allow designees to perform other activities on our behalf.
Thank you very much. Dr. Dillingham, prior GAO studies dating back to 2004 have raised some concerns about the strength of FAA's oversight of designers, including FAA's staff workload. Can you provide us some of the specifics of those concerns and how you see the progress being made?
Yes, ma'am. When we first looked at the designees and the organizational delegation issues, our concerns were that FAA may not have enough resources to adequately oversee the actual delegates, and that in fact some of the designees were not actually trained as they should have been to do the job that they were being asked to do, and it was a question of how difficult it was for FAA to remove those designees when they were determined that they were not meeting the standards. Since that time, those issues have been addressed by FAA, and they are continuing to be addressed by FAA and industry as well. So those issues are on the wane.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Meadows is not back yet. Mr. Ribble.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you both for being here this morning. I just really have one question I wanted to address to Mrs. Gilligan. Thank you for being here. The FAA Air Certification Service, I'm re-quoting out of page 3 on your written testimony. The FAA Aircraft Certification Service has both a high volume and wide range of certification applications under review at any given time. In fiscal year 2013 alone, the FAA approved 189 revisions to aircraft type certificates, 440 new supplemental type certificates, STCs, for aircraft components, an additional 397 amended STCs, and over 2,200 parts manufacturer approvals for replacement parts on aircraft. I'm curious, do you know how many of these approvals were done with the ODA certification process?
I don't offhand, sir, but I'm sure we can get you that data.
Could you give me your take on how the ODA is working?
Yes. We're very encouraged by how it's working. We think that there are some that have been very successful. Certainly the larger manufacturers that we see are able to implement them more effectively so far. I think one of the concerns you may have heard is that it needs to be a scalable process, and we agree with that. So we're looking at how we can continue to improve the use of the organizational delegation because we do see it as a tool in the future that allows us to delegate even more of the findings of compliance. So I think we're learning as we go. I think we've seen some, again, that have been very successful, and there's still improvements that can be made.
In your opinion, is the ODA pretty much fully implemented now?
I think.
And why wouldn't you use it if it's not?
Well, again, I think it is fully implemented at some of the larger manufacturers when they've applied for it and they've put in place the process that's necessary for it. I know we have heard concerns raised by some of our smaller manufacturers that it is overwhelming for them to put in place, and so they're not pursuing it. And that, I think, is something we need to continue to work with those manufacturers to scale it so that it is appropriate for their needs, so that we and they can take better advantage of it.
Okay. Thank you very much. And Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Mr. Nolan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just got a short statement and a couple of things. One is I want to add my concern to the concern expressed by other members of this committee with regard to the need to expedite the certification process, the need to find that I'm not sure was addressed, but better training and education programs for the workforce that's necessary for this industry, and express my concern about the FAA workforce and the workload that is required to meet this incredibly rising demand. My question is, this committee and the Congress here this past year passed a new regulatory regime for the manufacturers of small aircrafts. And Ms. Gilligan, I appreciate if you would kind of update us on how that is progressing. That's very important to many of us, including those up in Duluth, Minnesota, where Cirrus Manufacturing exists and is doing a remarkably good job in creating a new aircraft, both for the domestic and the international market. Thank you, please.
Yes, sir. Part 23, the rewrite of Part 23 is an extremely important initiative for the administrator and our deputy administrator. It is also a first-of-its-kind project to take an entire part of our regulations and rewrite all of it. As you might imagine, there's a lot of interaction among all the parts, and as we do this, we want to be certain that we are improving the certification process and not losing any of the safety requirements that we have in place. We have a very dedicated team led by one of our executives in Kansas City who's responsible for small aircraft certification. He brings a personal dedication to this project. The schedule is somewhat slower than the legislation had envisioned, but going through notice and comment rulemaking and then through final rulemaking does take a period of time. But we monitor this project on a monthly basis at our executive levels. I keep the administrator informed as well. We are meeting our internal schedule. We are identifying and solving issues that come along so the team can continue to make progress. And we'll be glad to keep you and your staff informed of the progress as we proceed.
Thank you. Can you give us a date as when you
yes, sir. The
projected?
Final rule is right now planned for, I believe it's December of 2017. That is later than the statute, which called for a final rule by the end of 2015. But again, first the complexities of writing the rule and then getting it published for notice and comment and considering those comments and finalizing the project will take a considerably longer period of time than was anticipated in the statute. We have a detailed schedule. We are meeting that schedule at this point, and again, we'll be glad to keep you informed about that schedule.
Well, thank you for that, and please, I know it means a lot to all the members of this committee to have that whole process be a focus of important attention for your agency to get that done as soon as possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Nolan. Mr. Rodney Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Gilligan, thank you again for being here. It's great to follow the chairman and Mr. Nolan because they took my 2 questions for you. But I
appreciate their efforts on my behalf.
But I do want to also let you know I too am concerned with the Section 313 implementation or lack thereof in many cases, and I'm also concerned, as Mr. Nolan was, with getting the Small Airplane Revitalization Act, implementation moving along much more quickly. So I'll move to Dr. Dillingham. Welcome again, sir. It's good to speak with you again. Your testimony reinforces that change is tough, and the FAA's workforce seems to be a little reluctant to implement some significant changes to the way business is currently being done there. The GAO usually provides good recommendations, but what can you recommend to change the culture of an agency?
Thank you, sir. What we have found from our work is that that although change takes time, if in fact there is commitment and accountability for that change from the top all the way through to the field locations that have to implement it, that's helpful. If that change is incentivized, that's also helpful. It is in fact a tough thing to do, but what we said earlier this morning was that when FAA has some successes, that success needs to be communicated broadly and widely, and FAA is also currently working with major industry partners to implement that cultural change, which is also very critical. So we are guardedly optimistic that although it may take some time, it will in fact happen.
Okay. Well, my next question, industry's concerned about the FAA's lack of performance measures. 9 out of 14 of those measures have yet to be developed. What is the overarching factor holding the FAA back from establishing these performance measures?
I'd be glad to answer that one. I think, as Dr. Dillingham has identified, first of all, performance metrics are very difficult. And so we're working with industry to try to develop what are the right ways to measure this. I understand there was a discussion within the last 2 weeks between our aircraft certification leadership and industry leaders. And again, what we tend to come down to are counting things. How many of these did we do, or how many of that did we do? And I think, as Dr. Dillingham's testimony makes clear, that's not a measure of your performance or the effectiveness of your changes. It's simply a number. And what we're trying to do is understand, how do you really measure that if we make this change, it has effectively made the process more efficient? So we'll continue to work with industry so that we and they can reach an agreement on these are the right measures. If you implement this thing and you get to this outcome, we'll know we were successful. And that's what we're struggling with. Well,
and that's what we're struggling with, too, as policymakers. We want to see the performance measures put in place. We don't want to create a new bureaucracy that discusses performance measures and how to measure performance measures and et cetera, et cetera. So that's our concern, too. And Dr. Dillingham, issues with the FAA certification approval process has obviously resulted in delays and higher costs for the aviation industry. And as a policymaker, I want to push the FAA to become more efficient more quickly. What are some recommendations you have for future FAA reauthorizations that would get us this result?
I think probably the most important thing and probably the most efficient thing that could be done is to make sure that those recommendations that have been made, those initiatives that have been identified to address those recommendations, that there is actual implementation of those, that there is accountability associated with them. The recommendations that are on the table from the 2012 reauthorization are pretty robust and cover most of all the issues that have been brought to the Congress over the last few years and that have been identified by our study. So that's the first thing, is do what's already on the table, accountability and oversight, as this hearing is doing.
Thank you both for being here, and thank you for your testimony. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Ms. Titus.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. When you go last, you get to hear all the questions, so you can kind of look for themes, and it seems to me that every question kind of has the same theme. FAA is understaffed, it's hidebound, it's too slow, it's too old-fashioned, it can't keep up with the industry, and it just needs more time. Well, the industry doesn't have a lot of time. They are moving rapidly, and one of the areas where you see this that impacts domestic aviation is in the unmanned aircraft development. Nevada, I represent Las Vegas, was one of the 6 states, as you know, chosen as a test site for the integration of these UAVs, and we're no stranger to that. We have Creech Air Force Base, we have the Predator, we have the Reaper. We're ready to go, but it doesn't seem like a lot of people are starting to test because of the uncertainty. They don't know what the rules are or what's going to happen. So, Ms. Gilligan, could you kind of update us on how the test site program is progressing and what's happening with the development of the UAV small vehicle rule that y'all were going to develop? Tell us where we are with that so we can kind of go back and give folks some reassurance that we're moving forward in this area.
I'd be glad to, Congresswoman. As you know, 4 of the test sites are already up and operational, and we are working closely with them to understand what research and development initiatives they're undertaking and how we can learn from and take advantage of that data. As you know, we will be sharing the data that they collect. We'll be using the Technical Center up in New Jersey to help us do the analysis of all of that data. And all of that will help inform what standards, both for operation as well as for design and manufacture, that we need to put in place. On the manufacturing side, or the design side, we actually have approved two aircraft systems already. They're operating up in Alaska. They started last summer. They're operating this summer. Obviously, that's a low-risk environment, but we're learning a lot about the design requirements that we had for those systems that can help us better understand how to set the design standards for sort of a more robust operation. And the small UAS rule, is making, I will tell you, making great headway. We have completed our review at the FAA. It is in the executive review process now. It is a top initiative for our administrator, and so I think we will see we're hoping to see strong support in getting it through the process and published so we can begin to get comments. And I think that will begin to answer a lot of the questions that I know some of the applicants at the test sites are concerned about.
And will that be this year, next year, by the Christmas?
Our schedule calls for the notice to be published by the end of this year. And as I said, the administrator is pushing hard to see if we can beat that schedule.
I appreciate that. And my second part of the question is, this is going to open up a whole new industry, new myriad of products and procedures that will fall under your domain. How do you see this affecting the other work that you do that we've been talking about this morning? Have you got the personnel and the resources to take this part of the industry on and still keep up with these other things that have been asked about?
Well, certainly in future budget years, we'll need to look at whether this is driving a new need for resources, both in numbers and in skill sets. We may need a different kind of skilled employee as well. And so that will be addressed in the budget process. But in the meantime, yes, I think we're confident. As you know, I believe at the test centers, we are arranging for designations there for us to be able to designate representatives to be able to make safety findings at the test sites so that those operations can be determined to meet the appropriate safety standard without additional FAA oversight. So we are looking at how we can take advantage of the designee system to begin the support for UAS systems right now from the ground up.
I hope that'll be some kind of standardization and we won't see a problem of shopping the test sites like we heard earlier about shopping the different areas because different regional offices do different quality of work. Doctor, are you going to say something?
Yes, I wanted to just note that this subcommittee has asked us to conduct a pretty comprehensive review of UAS integration into the NAS. And as a part of that review, a lot of focus is on research and development, so we are going to be looking at the issues and concerns of the test sites and how that process is going. We're going to be looking at what are going to be the resource needs and timelines involved in integrating UAS into the NAS. So hopefully by the end of the year or early next year, we will have that comprehensive report for this subcommittee.
Thank you. Would you keep our office updated as you move forward with that study?
Absolutely.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Hanna.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Titus. I have Griffiths Air Force Base, which is one of the 6, and the 174th, and of course, Watertown. But I have a different question. Correct me if I'm wrong, Ms. Gilligan, but you stated that you have adequate resources, and Dr. Dillingham has said that there are cultural issues. We've heard from the FAA Director of Flight Standards that there's a backlog of over 1,000 certifications and authorizations for the National Air Queue space. And then we go on to hear from the manufacturers. The FAA has made some progress towards addressing this is in Mr. Dillingham's statement, but we're hearing but this committee is hearing the absolute opposite from interested parties and stakeholders. So if you have adequate resources, maybe I misheard you. The other thing I want to ask you, just fundamentally, is there a difference between a risk-based approach that you talk about and the outcome-based approach that Dr. Gillingham talks about? You both use different language, but it isn't clear to me that you mean the same thing, so I'm kind of curious.
I think actually, Congressman, there are two parts of the process. When we talk about a risk-based approach, we mean that we want to make sure that that we are focused, we at the FAA, the limited resources that we have, are identifying where a manufacturer may be adding a new element to their process or a new product that might introduce risk into the system that we haven't fully understood and analyzed, and that's the project that our inspectors or our engineers should be focused on. Mm-hmm. That's how we determine what work we should take on and determine what work can be left to the designees who work on our behalf to make certain findings. That's kind of at the front end of the process.
Dr. Gillingham, would you like to comment about that? Am I reading something into this that doesn't exist? You talk about the cultural issues, and of course, Ms. Gilligan admitted that there are cultural changes going on that present some issues, which are, I guess, understandable. But how big a barrier to getting this whole thing moving forward is there between those two elements?
It's hard to put an exact percentage on it, but let me talk a little bit and see if I can add some clarity to what we said before. The resource issue for FAA is there. There is a resource issue, and I think that is why the designee program, which has been going on for many years now, and now being expanded to organizational designees, is there to supplement those resources and to address that resource constraint. When we talk about culture change, we're talking about the difference between what FAA has traditionally done, where they had the inspectors who could go out and touch each wheel or touch each cert that it needed that was a part of its portfolio, as well as do its other surveillance activities. That day is long since passed, and the idea now is to move towards, delegating more of those kinds of things to the industry with FAA oversight. The outcome versus output, that we were talking about referred more to, or at least in part, to the metrics that when FAA talks about, we are implementing various and sundry recommendations and or we are installing certain amounts of equipment. We're saying that that's not the measure. The measure is what difference does it make in the certification process? Mm-hmm. How much more efficiency? What are the gains for industry? And so all of those concepts are sort of.
So you're kind of saying to me that, and correct me if I'm wrong, that they've lost their ability to be practical in their work process, that they've become excessively bureaucratic. Is that close, or?
I wouldn't say that. I think they are being practical by recognizing that they can't do everything that's required of them and moving towards this ODA process in concert with industry. Mm-hmm. I think I'd say it that way.
Thank you. My time's expired.
Thank you. Mr. Meadows.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Dillingham, I want to come to you with regards to the certification process, and if you could help me understand a little bit better, I guess, sequencing and why that has worked or has not worked.
I think one of the major concerns with the project sequencing was that it was.
Now you're saying was, it probably should be is.
Yeah,
right?
is.
Okay.
Is.
Right.
That, or at least the concern that has been expressed is that it came from headquarters or was centrally located, whereas an alternative would be to be more locally based, where the decisions could be made quicker and more efficiently.
So do you see the prioritization program as being an improvement?
I would say it is an improvement, and although it's early on in the process, I think keep the efforts that FAA has made to work with the unions and work with industry will make it get better in the future as we go on.
So right now, though, in terms of if I were a civil aerospace company, would I know with certainty whether I was going to get a certification or not based on either first come, first serve? How do I plan? I mean, can I properly plan? Because it doesn't appear that I could.
If I may, Congressman, I think you've identified exactly what we've seen as well. The issue is not, it's a little less about timing and much more about predictability. So the process that we had in place notified the applicant every 30 or 60 days, I forget what the interval was, whether we could or could not begin their project until we could. And so the dilemma for the manufacturer was they didn't know if it was going to be in 60 days or 6 months.
So you're telling me there's no certainty whatsoever, and we're investing millions and millions of dollars, and they have to hope that one day they get a letter and say, oh, by the way, we're going to certify you, or start the process.
So that was the way we were doing it. Now, we were also we had a metric to approve projects within, I believe, a 90-day timeline. And for most of the projects, we actually made that. But the applicant may not know that that was what the measure was. What the new process will do is allow for that predictability. When we receive the application, the engineer involved will analyze what the value of the project is from a safety perspective and some of the other criteria that we have in place, and determine when that project can be turned on. The applicant will be given a project number, which means that the project is underway, and they can use their designees in the interim. We can enter the agreement for what the schedule will be. What we're trying to address is that concern about predictability so that the applicant, the manufacturers, can know when they can expect that the project will move forward. We believe that that will go a long way to improving or to addressing the concerns.
Okay, you identified this, am I correct, Ms. Gillingham? You identified this back in Gilligan, I apologize, in 2011, Is that correct? The FAA recognized that this was a problem, and then again in 2012.
Well, we had the sequencing program in place for a number of years, and throughout all that time, we were always trying to find ways to improve it and enhance it. So we moved it away from where the local office would say, no, we don't have the technical skills, so we have to delay your project, to a national approach where we could see, do we have the appropriate skills somewhere around the country so that we can get the project started more quickly. So over time, we've made improvements, and this will be the next.
Okay, tell me why you're not going to meet your milestone. I think that's, according to testimony, it looks like that you're not going to meet the milestone for implementation this year. Is that correct?
No, sir, we actually disagree with Dr. Dillingham. It is true we had interim milestones in order to get this in place by the end of the year. One of the interim milestones has been delayed because of additional consultation with our unions, but we are still focused on implementing this by the end of this calendar year.
Yeah, but the milestone was July, so we've got 8 more days. So that milestone, you're going to meet that milestone as well?
No, the final milestone for implementation has been the end of.
But milestones are exactly that. They go one step at a time, so you don't have to wait till the end.
I agree.
So you're not meeting your milestone. So he would be correct.
There is the interim milestone that has been delayed. We acknowledge that, and we agree. We're now working, though, to assure that we have it in place, the program in place by the end of the year. It happens.
Well, we'll be waiting for those results. I appreciate the patience of the chair.
Mr. Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank both of you for being here today, as always. I'm from Texas, and Texas is home to 2 major rotorcraft manufacturers, Bell Helicopter and Airbus Helicopters. My questions today concern the challenges in the certification. We've talked about that, and installation of equipment, safety-enhancing technology to rotorcraft compared to the large transport airplanes and small airplanes. So, Dr. Dillingham, my question would be to you. In the course of your review of the certification process, have you found any particular concerns or frustrations expressed by rotorcraft manufacturers? And if so, can you discuss the concerns and why they are happening?
I think to the extent that we've looked at certification and had a chance to do some interviews, the rotorcraft manufacturers had similar concerns as did the regular aircraft manufacturers in terms of delays or different regulatory interpretations. I think the example that I remember was more on the international front, in which an approval was granted by FAA here, but when that rotorcraft was taken overseas, the time that it took and the cost was similar to what the original cost and time was for FAA certification. And the concern was expressed that this was sort of duplicating and having a very negative effect on that manufacturer. We propose to look at that issue for rotorcraft manufacturers and others as we pursue the committee's request to look at international issues and how international certification is going.
I know they would appreciate that. Just one additional question. Are there any initiatives that could help address some of these things we're talking about, like making progress on reducing regulatory inconsistency, which we talked about? And are there any best practices that could be learned from directorates like Transport or Small Airplane?
I think the key initiative that we have heard from almost unanimously is the idea of setting up this automated database that brings all of the regulations and all of the guidance under one umbrella, where it can be searched by both industry and FAA inspectors, so that inconsistency will start to go away when an inspector can punch up the various and sundry ways that certification and approvals have been made in the past, and they don't have to start anew or impose their own particular interpretation on something. And the next move up is, if there is a disagreement, then there is a procedure being developed that will address that. We think that that's the most critical element necessary to move forward on regulatory interpretation.
New concept, make it easier, right?
Yes, sir.
I appreciate you being here, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Lipinski.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you for holding this hearing on domestic aviation manufacturing, and I'm very pleased that our subcommittee continues to remain active in monitoring of the work to improve FAA's regulatory process and also the domestic manufacturing sector. I'm a big promoter of American manufacturing. Aircraft manufacturing is also especially important to me, and maybe it goes back to 35, 40 years ago when I played Little League Baseball at Aircraft Gear Field in Bedford Park. I know how important, especially aviation aircraft manufacturing is to the American economy. Now, we're all mindful that the FAA reauthorization is coming up. We need to get that done next year, and welcome this opportunity to learn more about what has been done and what's being done. And one of the biggest issues that I focused on during my time on the subcommittee is streamlining the FAA certification process to make sure that manufacturers can move innovative, safety-enhancing ideas from the design table to the assembly line into the cockpit without months of delays and unnecessary costs. I was the lead Democratic co-sponsor of the Small Airplane Revitalization Act, which requires the FAA to streamline the certification process to small aircraft by December 2015, and I hope to learn how Congress can continue to support other parts of the aviation manufacturing sector. Whether it's implementing this bill, developing regulatory certainty under Section 312, or finalizing the competition to develop a new aviation gas, progress in this area is absolutely necessary to improve aviation efficiency, enhance safety, and help support America's status as a global leader in aviation. Which leads me into a question for Ms. Gilligan. As you know, the American aviation industry, the FAA included, has set the standard for innovation, quality, and safety. But there are always challenges to our leadership on this. You noted that the FAA facilitates the import and export of aircraft components in a global economy and cited the establishment of bilateral agreements with 47 countries. I'm interested to learn what efforts the FAA has made to advance the reputation and standing of its standards in American aviation products generally, and how our bilateral partners view the FAA's type certifications. How do the FAA's efforts measure up in comparison to those of its bilateral agreement partners? Are there ways this can be improved? And also, what constraints in improving this does the FAA face? I think this is all vitally important, that we make sure that America remains the gold standard here. So just interested in what the FAA is doing right now in this area.
Thank you, Congressman. First, I think it's quite widely accepted that the actual standards for design and manufacture of aircraft originated in the United States and in only a few other countries around the world. And we continue to lead the world in setting what is the safety standard against which one designs and builds an aircraft. So I don't think there's really a question about whether the U.S. standards for design are the gold standards. I do think what we're seeing is a phenomenon around the world where other countries are expanding, trying to build their own technical expertise in aviation safety. And we have seen countries where they are taking a more active part in the review of product certification before they allow that product into their country. Those authorities have the same responsibility we in the FAA have of determining that a product that's coming into their country is safe. We believe that that will change with time and that those emerging economies will understand that it can be much more efficient for them to take advantage of the expertise of the U.S. or if it's a European product of the Europeans, just as we and the Europeans have already made that, come to that realization. So when the U.S. certifies a product, it's not at all uncommon for the Europeans to issue their approval the very same day or the next day, because we and they have worked together with the manufacturer throughout that project to determine compliance with the appropriate safety standards. We continue to work with the bilateral partners who are, at times, we believe, interposing or asking for more than is necessary for them to accept a U.S. approval. And we're making headway.
Not to interrupt you, I'm just running out of time. I just want to ask one other question. Why is there going to be a 2-year delay. What is the cause of the 2-year delay in the implementation of the Small Airplane Revitalization Act?
Yes, sir. The deadline that was given in the statute, in our opinion, was just too difficult to meet. The Part 23 is a very big, complex part of our rules, and a complete rewrite this is really the first time we've ever taken on a project like this. So what we want to make sure is that we are, in fact, streamlining the process, but that we are not reducing the level of safety in those standards. We have a dedicated team that is working hard to keep this project moving forward. But we do need to do the rewrite. We need to put it out for comment. We do expect that the industry will want a fair amount of time because it's such a complex project. And then we need to consider those comments and make whatever changes are necessary to the final rule. And that, we believe, will take an additional 2 years.
I want to, I'm over time. I thank the chairman for letting me go here, but I just want to say I'd like to follow up later on what we can do here so that we can move this process forward more quickly. Thank you.
We'll be glad to follow up with you, sir.
Mr. Bouchon.
First of all, thank you both for being here. It's very much appreciated. Most of my questions have been answered, except for what I'm hearing a lot of is that part of the delay process is a quote-unquote cultural change that's required at the FAA at a federal agency. And in almost every federal agency I've ever had testify in front of Congress, they've said the same thing. And so at some point, my question basically is, the leadership at the FAA knows what needs to be done. Congress has mandated it, put it into law. And so what are the cultural impediments to change? If you were in a private company, and I know I'm not naive enough to think that it's not a totally fair comparison, and a new CEO came in and there was going to be a cultural shift. It doesn't happen overnight, first of all, but people that are working at the company that don't feel comfortable with that working environment leave, and at the end of the day, ones that are impediments to that cultural shift are fired. So what is the real, what is the impediment? You mentioned, you're in discussions with your unions about discussions with the unions about what? There needs to be a cultural change at the FAA. It's mandated by Congress. It's put into law. What's the discussion? So, yes or no, is that the main impediment to a cultural change at the FAA?
No, sir. I think that the reality is change is always difficult. But I can assure you that the administrator has, as one of his significant initiatives, that FAA will move to a risk-based decision-making process. The leadership at FAA understands that, and the workforce is actually coming to understand what that means for them. So we have, I think, we've made good steps in bringing this change. And we just need, I think Dr. Dillingham's point is, we need to manage it actively. We need to not assume this will just work its way out. And that's why the action plans that we have, for example, with the milestones, are a way that we can continue to measure that we're making progress at bringing about this change. Some of the recommendations are that we need to change the training we provide to our inspectors or to our engineers so they can better understand what it means to identify risk and how to mitigate it and those kinds of things. We agree that training is under development, and that will be provided. That will begin, that will support this continued move forward toward this kind of approach. I can tell you broadly, the workforce wants to make this move. They believe that there are risks that they can understand and mitigate, and they want to focus on that. They are a conservative workforce in that when you are a safety professional, change introduces risk. And you want to make sure before you make the change that you're doing the right thing. So that's what we have to bring them along to be confident that they have the skills to make this to take this kind of an approach.
I'm not criticizing the workforce at all. I'm just saying, that themselves, but maybe the leadership of the workforce, maybe I am slightly criticizing. But, how long is this type of thing? Because I do hear almost every federal agency say the same thing. When Congress has put something into law, set a deadline, and the deadline's not met, they say it's because there's this big difficult cultural shift that has to happen, and we have to make all these changes, and then frequently hide behind safety issues. Well, it's a safety issue because if we quickly change this process, you know, it might impair safety and there might be something happen. I mean, this is a common narrative. And frankly, I think, you know, Congress gets frustrated by that, both political parties sometimes, when, you know, when you have an issue like this, and clearly when industry is frustrated, and honestly, when American competitiveness is at risk, not only in aviation, but across our manufacturing sector, when, you know, when we can't quickly change. Let me just use FDA as an example. I was a medical doctor before. Businesses in Indiana, in my district, are introducing their new products in foreign markets before they are in the United States. Why? Because they can't get approval fast enough to introduce them here. It's a travesty when you have American manufacturers can't produce their own products and release them in their own country because a federal agency, you know, has cultural changes that have to be made and that are, I think somebody mentioned, might be 20 years ago. For example, Cessna's building planes in China, you know, and so I would just implore the FAA to, you know, to do everything they can to comply with what Congress has asked FAA to do. Let's help American manufacturing and continue to make America the best place in the world to manufacture. I yield back.
Thank you. Ms. Gilligan, you touched on this with, I think, Ms. Titus, but I'd like you to try to expand a little bit. Given the many different types of small unmanned aircraft, will each need to be certified, each platform need to be certified? Or how are you going to, I know you started this in Alaska, but this is an area where technology is moving very quickly. Can you shed any light on this for us?
Yes, sir. I think, as you know, in the reauthorization bill, you provided us some guidance on how to address small UAS up to 55 pounds. Those will be covered in the small UAS rule that we expect to publish by the end of the year. And I think you'll see there that we've hit a good balance in terms of what the safety standards or determinations need to be for the operation of those small systems. For larger systems, and as you know, these systems can be as large as any of our standard aircraft, we believe that there will be safety design requirements and manufacturing requirements that will be appropriate. The two certifications that we issued for the aircraft systems up in Alaska gave us an opportunity to look at our standards and to identify those that would seem appropriate to apply to this kind of system. So, for example, we have a number of design standards that apply to making the aircraft safe for people or crew who are in the aircraft. Obviously, those standards don't need to apply in this setting. So that's what we're really working on. We have 3 other applicants for certification right now in our LA office. We believe that there may be another 1 or 2 that will come along. And we will work through that process to identify what are the applicable standards and what are standards that they don't need to meet in order to demonstrate that the system is safe both in design and for manufacture.
Okay. I'd like to thank you, Ms. Gilligan, Dr. Dillingham. We will recess briefly while the first panel moves out and welcome the second panel. I'd like to welcome our second panel today, and our second panel includes Ms. Marion Blakey, President and CEO of Aerospace Industries Association, Mr. Pete Bunce, President and CEO of General Aviation Manufacturers Association, Mr. Joe Brown, President of Hartzell Propellers, Mr. Dave Cox, Lead Administrator of Air Washington Project. Ms. Blakey, you are now recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I do want to thank not only our chairman, but Ranking Member Larson. I'm delighted to see Congressman Lipinski here and others that I know we have worked very closely with in terms of aviation safety and manufacturing issues. I'm also very pleased to be able to discuss our views from the standpoint of the Aerospace Industries Association on the state of domestic aircraft manufacturing and, frankly, the challenges that we face in an increasingly competitive global market. We're proud that commercial aviation manufacturing remains the leading contributing sector to U.S. net exports and that domestic aircraft sales continue to climb. Last year, we had a positive trade balance of $72 billion, our best in history. This healthy export record underscores our industry's deserved reputation for both safety and quality. But it's also a testament to an industry that invests billions of dollars in R&D in order to keep our competitive edge. The use of higher strength, lighter weight materials, nanotechnologies, 3D printing, and cleaner biofuels all help to make our aircraft more durable and efficient and illustrate our commitment to being second to none. But as much as the United States leads the pack, we face stiff competition in a global market, often by foreign firms that are highly subsidized by their governments. However, if we have the support of strong U.S. government policies to streamline the regulatory environment, provide equitable financing terms, invest in the modernization of our air transportation infrastructure, our industry can then continue to do what it does best: innovate, compete, and create jobs for literally hundreds of thousands of high-skilled workers. Let me discuss some of the challenges our industry faces. First, we appreciate this committee's strong support for streamlining FAA's aircraft certification processes. Now it's imperative that the FAA follow through and ensure at the working level that the Organization Designation Authorization, ODA, is used as intended. This will allow the FAA to take advantage of industry expertise and increase the collaboration and partnership that leads to improved aviation safety. Secondly, we're concerned by the millions of dollars it costs our manufacturers to get other nations to certify equipment that the FAA has already certified. We're eager to work with the FAA to improve the acceptance of FAA-approved products beyond our own borders. Let's turn to the big issue before Congress right now, and that is the reauthorization of the Export-Import Bank of the United States. I can't stress enough that our industry counts on EXIM guarantees and credit assistance to compete for international sales on a level playing field. Thousands of U.S. workers who build our wide-body and general aviation aircraft and helicopters at companies up and down the supply chain owe their very jobs to that support. If Congress fails to reauthorize EXIM by September 30th, there will be fewer workers at plants across our country and more at the plants of foreign countries. It's just that simple. The future of our aviation infrastructure is another major concern. As this committee well knows, because you all have worked on this a great deal, our nation's air transportation system is experiencing serious capacity challenges. Ongoing next-gen modernization efforts are making a huge difference in helping to reduce congestion, delays, and improve safety. But to be fully effective, next-gen must be fully funded. Unfortunately, FAA's next-gen budget request for the coming year is $200 million below the administration's request of only 2 years ago. If sequestration returns in fiscal year 2016, we urge the Congress to take a hard look at needed investments for the future and ensure that NextGen doesn't fall behind. We also hope to see additional progress toward the integration of the beneficial use of unmanned aircraft systems in the domestic airspace. The FAA has taken initial steps on UAS integration, but more needs to be done. For example, the agency needs to ensure that the proposed rule for the development of equipment and operator standards for small UAS remains on track for later this year and isn't further delayed. Finally, for our industry to meet future market demand, we need to address an aging workforce with a major commitment to STEM education and customized workforce training. In conclusion, we believe that U.S. aviation manufacturers are in a strong competitive position today. With appropriate policies to spur innovation, improve air transportation infrastructure, and replenish the workforce, our industry can continue to lead the world in aviation progress. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Bunch, you're recognized.
Thank you, Chairman Lobiando. Mr. Lipinski, I just want to again commend this committee for the deep dive that you continue to do into certification and our ability to be able to get product to market. So it's vitally important to us as manufacturers and for the jobs that we provide in the nation. It is a lot of jobs, 1.2 million jobs, and the world has really changed since the economic downturn. We now export 50% in virtually every segment of general aviation. So even piston aircraft, 50% of those aircraft are going overseas because it is an expanding market. It's a growing pie. The rest of the world is waking up to general aviation as well as commercial aviation. And that's why I'd like to start with just voicing my extreme frustration in what we heard in the first panel today. The United States Congress unanimously last year passed the Small Aircraft Revitalization Act, both chambers unanimously. The President signed into law the Small Aircraft Revitalization Act Thanksgiving last year. It requires that the FAA have this rule done by December of next year, 2015. And yet we had the Associate Administrator come up here this morning and say, no, we're going to be 2 years late. Now, we've worked on this whole initiative since back in 2007, so it's nothing new. And the FAA coined the term twice the safety at half the cost. So think about that. We're talking about doubling the amount of safety in the light end of general aviation and reducing the cost by half to both the government and industry, and yet the bureaucracy is saying, we don't care what you, Congress, say. We don't care what the President says. We're going to get it done when we want to get it done, and it's going to be 2 years late. And that's exactly what we have to put up with industry. One of the questions earlier today was predictability. We have no predictability. And when you're in a development program that you're trying to certify aircraft, and your burn rate in a large aircraft program is $10 million a month, and yet you don't have any predictability of when it's going to get done, how are you going to be profitable in this industry? How are you going to continue to employ folks in this industry? We have got to make this change. And to Chairman Schuster's comment about 20 years for cultural change, we don't have that amount of time. And we heard about this continually in the last panel. Cultural change. We have got to be able to give tools to managers to drive this change. This is the new world. We're not going to get more resources for the FAA. We've got to let managers manage. We've got to measure the workforce. There is resistance within the workforce to be individually measured. We've got to incentivize these different offices so that those that underperform and are not allowing industry to use their delegation authorities don't get the same bonuses that those that are at the other end of the scale that are allowing us to use those. And we have to be able to force the FAA to do things that they tell industry that they're going to do, such as sequencing, as you heard this morning. Again, they are well behind after talking about it for 2 years. Now, on the consistency of regulatory interpretation, the 313 portion that you all wrote into the law in the last reauthorization, our frustration is very high there, too. 1,000 authorizations and certifications are awaiting through the flight standards portion of the FAA right now. Think about that. 1,000 roadblocks are in place. Now, this is for new charter operators. It's for new flight schools to be able to go and train more pilots. And it's for repair stations. Each one of those is directly translatable to jobs. And now you put that in the context of the fact that you have an FAA that duplicates expertise in many offices around the country, and if you have one inspector that says, okay, it's all right to do it, another inspector in another office can say, no, I don't accept what that FAA inspector said. That's not good enough for me. This is the way I look at it. How are we as industry supposed to do business in an environment like that? So it's vitally important to us of the work that this committee is doing, the great questions that you all asked in the previous panel, and we ask you to continue the pressure, because it's only through pressure from the United States Congress that is going to drive the change that we need for industry to be able to keep moving in aviation. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks. Wish next time you could be a little more clear about how you feel on this whole thing. Very, very well done, sharing a lot of our frustrations, capitalizing it. That's part of what we're continuing to attempt to do here. Mr. Brown, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Lipinski. I'm delighted to be here today. It's an honor. Frankly, let me start.
Could you pull your mic just a little closer, please?
I will.
Thank you.
So I said some thank yous and that it was an honor. And I'd like to start by saying I really think we're talking about the right things. I'm a small manufacturer in Ohio, and this subject matter resonates with me perfectly, and I find that very encouraging. So the company that I'm representing here primarily today is called Hartzell Propeller. It has a storied history. It was founded to furnish propellers to the Wright brothers. Our first recorded sale is 1917. We're approaching 100 years of manufacturing in Piqua, Ohio. We have high-tech jobs, engineers and machinists who bring home $75,000 a year in income, own Harleys, have fishing camps, live pretty well. We are a global leader, and our business in the last 5 years has really had to reposition as a global exporter. Sales retracted tremendously during the recession, North American sales, and we have filled that in with sales to foreign countries. We have about the same revenues today that we had at the peak, but our export sales have gone from 30% to 50% of total revenue. And that means that we are competing in a much more complex environment than what we've been accustomed to over almost a century of business. Why is it complex? Because we have to go make markets for ourselves in over 30 different countries. We have to engage with customers there. We have to engage with civil authorities there. We have to develop product support systems and propeller shops there. Much more complicated. In a little company in Ohio with 300 people, we have 2 native Chinese speakers on our payroll to help us make a market and to help us engage with the civil aviation authorities. We travel to about 30 countries a year and export to all of them. And significantly, in order to make those exports, we need foreign validations. Since 2007, we've gotten approximately 300 foreign validations, 150 in the last 2 years. So we are fully invested in growing our sales internationally. We're all in. I would like to just say I'm a big proponent of XM financing for our customers. We don't engage it directly, but I have these validations because I'm following my customers to market, and my customers appreciate XM. It levels the playing field, and it creates great jobs in the States. I'd like to turn quickly to the fact that in order to get to market, whether it be in the United States or in a foreign country, we must get some form of certification. In the United States, we get a type certificate, just like an airframer or an engine manufacturer. And then to sell internationally, that type certificate needs to be validated. So we are engaged regularly with the FAA and civil authorities across the world, and we have an ODA to do that. I think the ODA subject was very interesting today, particularly from the first panel. I think ours is about 7 years old. We were asked to adopt the ODA system, and we traded one delegation system for another. And after 7 years, I think the main point for me is that we have about the same level of service, which was good to begin with, but it costs us more to get the job done. ODAs are more expensive. So if you don't get better efficiency, it's a net loss to the business. And I think that we can make ODAs more efficient. And in Q&A, I hope I will have a chance to opine on that some more. Let me talk also about foreign validations. It takes an enormous amount of time to have a foreign country tell us that the FAA did a good job. We have put 300 validations requests in. We have gotten 300 affirmatives. FAA is batting 1,000 with their type certificates. But it takes us on average 21 weeks to receive that validation letter. Now, our design cycles are often 8 to 9 months. So think about a 5-month additional delay to follow a customer into a foreign market. It's very, very significant. And some of the longest validation processes come from bilateral countries. So I think this is a wonderful opportunity. I would appreciate your help. Let me just finish with the avgas initiative. I make propellers. We put a lot of them on piston aircraft. This Congress, this committee, and the FAA have been super in driving a transition process for an ab fuel that does not use lead. We have lots to do, but we are making great progress, and in Q&A, it's my hope that I could encourage us to stay on point. It's critical to the light end of general aviation. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Brown. Mr. Dave Cox, you're on.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Congressman Larson, for inviting me here today. Very anxious to talk to...
Can you pull the microphone up a little bit, please? Thanks.
Very anxious to talk to the committee today about a very exciting project that we've been a part of for the last 3 years, going on our 4th year now, the Air Washington project. And if you look at the screen, I'll use 3 short slides. Will not create death by PowerPoint here today, to illustrate what the project is and hopefully answer some interesting questions that the committee might have for me. First of all, next slide, in early 2011, the college system in the state of Washington recognized a need to look for a method to train our workforce, specifically in aerospace. The slide on the screen right now illustrates the scope of the Air Washington project. It's a project awarded through the U.S. Department of Labor. For us, it's a $20 million 3-year initial project focused on the aerospace industry and aerospace workforce in the state of Washington. What's not on this slide, and I won't read it to the committee, but what is not on this slide is Washington State actually produces 25% of all aerospace exports for this country. So it's a pretty big deal for us in the state of Washington. Next slide, please. In preparation for my testimony, I understood that, and I'm happy to talk about why we've had such a successful project with this grant. And I'm going to zero in on 5 different points that myself and my staff and managers have identified universally as the reasons why this project has been so well received by both business, industry, and our workforce. First of all, the fingerprint business. We matched, in this case, a significant grant opportunity to the fingerprint of the state of Washington. Again, I mentioned that 25% of all U.S. exports in aerospace come from the state of Washington. This was a form-fit, square peg, square hole of a project to a need. Second was industry connection. We did not move forward with this project. We didn't even start thinking about this project without being closely connected with all of our industries in our area, in our state, and that's from the Boeings all the way down to the small Unitex, even stretching over the border to Idaho. Number 3, state government connection. This is one of the, what I will claim is one of the advantages of working in the state of Washington. In the community college system, we have an organized community college system for the state. It was a relatively easy process for us to get a consensus of the colleges that wanted to, and needed to be a part of the consortium for this project and work within that construct. So state government and the organization of the state community college system really facilitated us getting off to a good start. Fourth, project management. This is something we've learned over time, how to manage a project of this size and this scope. A consortia of colleges is somewhat like cat herding. Depends on the day. Sometimes there's more cats, sometimes there's fewer. But we learned how to do this pretty effectively, and we're pretty happy to share those lessons learned and best practices with anybody who's willing to listen to us. And finally, navigation services. This is really a connection with the WIBs, our workforce development centers in the state. They are critical functions for the project that have, quite frankly, validated to business and industry what we're doing, how we're doing it, and the successes we're having, so that the buy-in, if you will, or the trust level of business and industry is extremely high with this project and what we're doing. So those are the 5 points that I'd be happy to expand on in Q&A when we get a chance. And at this point, I'd like to finish my spoken testimony.
Thank you to each of you for your testimony. I'll start with my questions, and I enjoyed your lively testimony, Mr. Bunce. I do share some concern, as you saw with the last panel, with Chairman Lobiano. I think the rest of my colleagues here on what you have to go through as an industry. Ms. Blakey, I enjoyed reading in your testimony about an example of a 50-year-old regulation that your folks have to make changes to a configuration just to pass the test and then have the configuration put back in its normal state. I'm interested, Ms. Blakey, what recommendation do you have besides the fact that I've co-sponsored legislation to call the Bipartisan Regulatory Improvement Act? Is anything short of a new law to go through these outdated regulations? Can you give us a recommendation that can fix this now?
Well, certainly the work that is being done on the small aircraft regulations is something that we all have great energy behind, and we think this kind of comprehensive overhaul is a great thing. You also heard how much time it's taking and how complicated it is. Yes. So I think we as industry need to also call to your attention specific areas, specific regulations and problems that we think need to be addressed where FAA does not seem to be able to do this on their own. I will say, though, that the FAA, through the CAST program and others, does collaborate, and the ARCs that they set up with industry can be highly effective. So I would call attention to that, because I think there is a great deal of incentive on both sides to try to set aside regulations that are simply no longer valid in this day and age.
So quicker implementation of 313 is obvious.
Absolutely.
All right. Mr. Bunce?
Mr. Davis, just to reiterate Ms. Blakey's point, so what the Small Aircraft Revitalization Act did was, in this instance that you spoke of, where we had to modify an engine and make it do something it physically is not able to do, to be able to meet a test point that's for engines that were built 20 years ago, that don't have sophisticated electronic controls and software. It's just crazy. So what this new method of doing business allows for is it lets international regulators sit down with industry and keep regulations fresh. So if there is new technology or new engines or new composites that come online, all the regulators get together with industry and say, this is the method of compliance that you can use here. So that's why this is so important to get it right and get it out on the small aircraft side, because the next step is to expand it to rotorcraft. And as Ms. Blakey just said, we want to extend it to the commercial side because it's the right way to do it, and we can keep regulations fresh, and we don't have to rule make continually, which we all know takes way too long. We can keep them fresh this way, and it'll be tremendously helpful for regulator and for the industry.
Thank you. And Mr. Brown, you said in your testimony you'd like to expand on your frustrations with the ODA process. Feel free to do so.
Well, I would say that our relationship with the FAA is pretty healthy. We have a great relationship with the folks in our ACO. They understand what we're trying to do. But we put in an ODA because we were asked to. And I think my issue is that approximately 7 years later, we should not be talking about the hard-to-gain efficiencies because of culture change. Had somebody said to me, if you put this system in and spend more annually to manage it, but 7 years from now we'll be talking about whether we can make it efficiency 3 years forward, I would have said, no thanks, I'll stick with my current program. So, you know, I consider them allies, but I also consider them with a narrative that doesn't quite work, and that is that there's no culture change problem. It's a will to apply the delegation authorization as written, and I'll just give you some quick examples. I think Ms. Gilligan hit it on the head when she said the assumption is a project is delegated. That should be the governing theme. I would also suggest that if a company has an ODA project whose test and qualification methods are the typical way to take a product to market for that company, then by nature the project cannot be new and novel. We have had occasions where we are going to use exactly the same test and qual methods that we normally use to get a product to market, but we have been told that our product is new and novel. And that makes no sense to me, and we could be very specific in that regard. And then last and finally, I guess I would say that there has to be a passionate advocate, or more than one, in the FAA who is likely to say something like, ODAs are a competitive advantage for leading manufacturers. They're winning in the world, and ODAs are part of that strategy. They will be efficient, offices will deploy them effectively, and the measurements will say so. But I don't hear that language. The language I hear is, we're working on culture change. And that leaves me feeling uncertain whether or not the payoff is to be found.
Gentleman from Illinois is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Since everyone enjoyed Mr. Bunce's comments earlier, I go give you an opportunity to expand on that and see if any of the other witnesses want to speak to this. The frustration is obvious amongst all of you and all of us here up on the dais with some of the issues with the FAA. So I want to just ask, as I said, Mr. Bunce first, and see if anyone else has a comment. What is the issue what is going on at the FAA from your perspective? What can we do as a legislative body here besides, maintaining our oversight? Is there anything else that can be done? We have the FAA reauthorization coming up, as I mentioned. You see anything else that we can do to help the FAA, I'll put it nicely, help the FAA work better on some of these issues, and certainly the 2-year delay in Sarah is really unacceptable. But what do you think can be done? What do you recommend?
Thank you, Ms. Lipinski. Industry has delivered everything that is required for the FAA to issue a notice of proposed rulemaking by the end of this year to the beginning of next year for Part 23. This would mean that the rule actually could be out by December of next year. What we are hearing is delaying this process are the lawyers inside the FAA. It is not, this has nothing to do with the other issue, the cultural change and the certification. This has to do with the legal entities within the FAA that think this is major sweeping change. And in fact, because the process had stalled so much was one of the reasons why we were so encouraged that Congress took up the issue of passing the law versus allowing just the rulemaking process to trudge along or go through this long slog. So I think it would be particularly helpful for us to, in response back to the answers that the Associate Administrator gave in the first panel, was to ask the questions why. What is the delay? Because industry has delivered our first portion enough to be able to give the notice of proposed rulemaking. And I actually think that we, industry, will be able to provide very valuable feedback if they got the NPRM out to be able to meet the intent of the law and get it out by the end of next year. As far as the larger cultural change issue with certification is concerned, again, trying to drive the workforce and the managers to be managers. We had one of our aircraft manufacturers from Olney, Texas, that builds crop dusters was in here yesterday. And it was great to see. We had over 100 staffers show up for a briefing on XM Bank and how important. Six of the seven aircraft on his line are all XM financed. So right now, with seven airplanes being built, 6 of them are XM financed. And the point he was making is he'll go and submit a program to his aircraft certification office, and the manager, instead of managing it and saying, this is the risk-based approach we want to take, just throws it over to the engineers and say, what do you think? So basically, there isn't this process of trying to drive change and trying to give them an overall direction and goal of how can we get this program through quickly and how can we improve safety as we go through it. It's just, okay, what do you guys think? And then what that encourages is it encourages the engineers to go down with the sharp pencil and do what they've always done, which is be down there in every little minute detail instead of using resources productively and saying, I'm going to be a safety manager of systems. And when a company has demonstrated its capability, as Mr. Brown's company has, with their ODA, to say they know how to do it, let's overall manage their safety processes to make sure that they can consistently do that, but not be down in that level of detail. And I think that will really help us.
May I add to this just a moment? Because the ODA was put in place in 2005 on my watch when I was FAA administrator. I believe in it tremendously, and our manufacturers believe it can be highly effective if fully implemented. So please understand that. We also experience a tremendous amount of frustration at the fact that it is not being fully implemented. I give us an example. We met just the other day with the Secretary of Transportation with several of our manufacturers. One of them has experienced 200 days of delay on a rotorcraft project and said that if the decision were before him again, he would have conducted the manufacture, taking the jobs, and the certification outside the country, because this is the failure of ODA in actual fact. So this is real. I do want, though, to point out, having been in that position and understanding some of the dynamics, that when we talk about culture change, we have to remember that the FAA is a highly unionized workforce with highly effective unions. And leadership there matters, as well as leadership within the FAA's own management team. Trying to put in place incentives and accountability is something that has to be worked on both sides. And at this point, I do think that we as an industry are advocating metrics. We are advocating specific measurements as to whether things are moving forward. And we're also advocating a gated approach so that everyone says that there are gates to be passed through, and both management and the team that's working on it recognize that those are incentives to hit those gates. So there are mechanisms, and I do think there are things that you all can do in the reauthorization to help address this.
Thank you. No, yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for being here. Mr. Brown, I'm going to go ahead and start with you. Give you a word of caution. About 10 years ago, I owned a commercial roofing company just outside of Appleton, Wisconsin, and I was invited to come and testify before a House subcommittee, and now here I am. Just a word to the wise here. You never know where frustration can lead you. I want to read something out of your testimony because you didn't do it, and I appreciate that, but I think it deserves to be heard. I'm on page 1. In addition to Hartzell Propeller, we own 3 other aviation manufacturing businesses and employ about 1,000 people in total. Joining Hartzell Propeller in our family of companies, Hartzell Aerospace is based in Valencia, California, and manufactures cabin environmental control products and subsystems for business, military, and commercial aircraft. Mayday Manufacturing is located in Denton, Texas, and produces specialty bushings for the entire aviation industry. Hartzell Engine Technologies is located in Montgomery, Alabama, and manufactures aircraft starters, alternators, turbochargers, and fuel pumps for general aviation aircraft. In all of our companies, we sell globally, but manufacture all of our products in the U.S. and buy all of our materials from U.S. producers. Thank you for doing that. I don't think, in many cases, I don't think American business people hear often enough from from members of Congress and from their government the appreciation that they deserve for what they do. I'm concerned when I sense your frustration. Mr. Bunce, you and I have spoken a number of times, and your frustration was so eloquently presented here this morning without even notes. You came well prepared. We get frustrated because Congress meets and laws are passed and presidents even sign them, and then sometimes they just get ignored. But you mentioned something, and Ms. Blakey mentioned something regarding the Export-Import Bank. Could you tell me, if you know, approximately what % of your business, your customers, what % of your customers who are purchasing from your companies here in the U.S. are using some form of export-import financing? Is it a large %? Is it a small %?
The answer is I don't know with the specificity that would be helpful to this conversation, in part because until a few months ago, I would have never imagined this would have been an issue in my business. XM is very, very old. It's an established way to incent exports, and the idea that it may not be reauthorized is new to me. What I can tell you is that when the reauthorization came under question, 3 or 4 of my top 10 customers told me that this was a big deal, and that a lot of my sales and my export growth was in fact flowing through their products, which were getting XM financing, particularly in the agricultural aircraft market, where 2 of my customers are the leaders. And they called to tell me that, in part so I was aware, but in part to tell me that the forecast after 2013, the month-by-month unit forecast for their build rate is in question. And they wanted me to understand that my assumptions for 2015 may not be founded. We heard from Air Tractor that 6 of their 7 aircraft on the line right now are bound for foreign market with XM financing attached. So going into 2015, we have taken a totally defensive position on hiring, and we've cut our capital budget plan in half, project by project, and not to be alarmist, but to be prudent. And so I guess my best answer for you is it's significant enough that my customers called me and said, watch your forecast. Let's be a little bit more cautious here, because I don't want you investing in things I can't deliver on as your aircraft manufacturing partner.
Thank you. Ms. Blakey, do you have any idea industry-wide what role the Export-Import Bank plays?
It has an enormous role to play because essentially it is what fills the gap, if you will, between what the commercial banks are able to do and what in fact is needed when you're exporting, as we all are more and more, to a wide variety of countries, some of which there simply is not available good commercial financing. In the developing world, sometimes the risk factors are considered to be too high. In some cases, those customers need to diversify their financing. And so across the board, we find, whether it's parts manufacturers or it is full aircraft, rotorcraft, et cetera, that it is very critical. And remember that also when Export-Import Bank financing helps make a sale possible, there's the whole aftermarket, which really isn't even calculated into the figures that are now being used. But that keeps on selling U.S. products out there. So it is enormously important and something that I could not agree with Mr. Brown more. None of us imagined that we would find ideological rhetoric somehow coloring what should be a very straightforward support for America's competitiveness and our business community. And it's taking a while, frankly, for the business community to even realize that this is in jeopardy. So we are very worried about this because September 30th is coming very quickly.
Thank you for your testimony. Thank you for being here. I yield back.
Ms. Blakely, we've referred to the Export-Import Bank for a moment longer. It's been referred to here widely as somehow corporate cronyism. I'd like you and Mr. Brown and Mr. Bunce to, if you quickly could respond to that. It's not something I necessarily agree with, and even understand, frankly, the phrase doesn't exactly strike me as meaningful. But the idea, I guess, behind it is that it helps larger companies more than smaller companies, and that Maybe you'd like to talk about that, because my personal opinion is that, and I'm a pilot, I've owned a small airport, I've waited years for certifications on planes that I've ordered, and I'm watching the industry that I care about die on the vine in this country, but yet we know that it's growing in other countries, and we have the most open airspace in the world. We're lucky for that, but maybe you'd like to speak to any part of that.
It's a phrase that isn't at all apropos or relevant. It obviously works on talk radio. It seems to pick up a little popularity here and there. But when you think about the fact that XM's support is going 90% to small businesses, 70% of Boeing aircraft, to use our largest manufacturer, in fact comes from suppliers. It is not as though there's some giant entity out there that doesn't have enormous dependence upon a lot of small companies all over this country. And when you look at the fact that they are up and trying to sell abroad to other countries who are providing massive amounts of not just loans, but real subsidy out there, the amount of money that XM is providing is very meager relative to the competitive landscape that we face worldwide. And it is about small businesses. The idea that we're talking about some sort of cronyism of enormous corporations.
What you're really saying is there are thousands of people like Mr. Brown's company, Hatzel, who contribute to these massive and hundreds of millions of dollars airplanes that trickle all the way down the food chain, so that the basic notion is wrong-headed. Is that fair?
That's fair. The 787 stands on the shoulders of thousands of small businesses.
Mr. Brown?
I wear the hat of Hartzell Propeller in one respect, and there's no question in my mind XM generates pull-through sales for my company. But I also serve as COO of Tailwind Technologies, which has these other aviation concerns, and we are deep in the supply chain for companies like Bell Helicopter and Boeing. And when they win, we win, period. And that's about 700 employees who did not understand how much the XM Bank was facilitating our local jobs until it came into question. And those companies are not walking around with their hand out. For example, to be ready to sell to the 787 in our small businesses, we had about $1.5 million worth of non-recurring R&D. We paid for it. We grew our workforce and our capacity in our machining business ahead of the curve. So we were in for about 7 multi-$100,000 machine tools, and we hired about 15 people. We did that so that when the 787 went to market, we could meet their schedule.
Mm-hmm.
That's investment. That's market risk. That is not walking around with your hand out.
Can I ask you, Mr. Bunce and Mr. Cox, too, it's implicit that the extra costs associated with this approval process, which you've indicated is the cost has grown even though the process is somewhat satisfactory. How does that, kind of self-answering question here, but how do you see that impacting our ability to grow our aviation industry abroad? And Mr. Cox, in Washington State, how many of the people that you're training are working for companies, not Boeing, but all other smaller companies? Go ahead, Mr. Bunce.
Well, Mr. Hanner, when we go and invest in the ODA and get it stood up, as Mr. Brown mentioned, it costs the companies money. But the reason they did it was on the promise that they would be able to be more efficient to get product to market, to have that predictability that they could control their destiny, but when they have new and novel technology that they bring on board, they can still go in to the FAA, have the expertise come over, in some cases train that expertise on the project that they're working on, and then collectively the FAA and industry go and work this together. And it is absolutely essential for us to be able to meet the demands of time to market, to be able to make the ODA work, because there are no more resources available to add engineers like we had.
So you're paying more and getting nothing more?
We're paying more, and as Mr. Brown said, it's static at best, but in some cases actually less. And then imperative in that calculation is also that training for the workforce. The workforce at the FAA, they're good people. They want to do the right thing, but by nature of the fact that they're in a bureaucracy, they're risk averse. So they're going to take the path that is the most conservative. So if we give them training to be able to say, this is what it means in a risk-based approach, we think they can produce for us. But that training is the key, and to let them know that they have the backing to make the change and that the risk doesn't fall on each and every one of their careers, that they have the backing of FAA management and, of course, the Congress.
Mr. Cox, thank you.
Thank you. So, as I remember the question, it's kind of the ratio of big employer to small employer. We've trained through this project a little over 3,500 folks at this point in time. At breaking that down, probably 500 or less are employed by the Boeing Company in our service areas, and the vast majority are employed by Tier 1, Tier 2 suppliers like Mr. Brown's company. Vast majority. That's where we find our real traction in our state. It's not to minimize the impact of the big manufacturer of Boeing.
I understand.
But it really is driven by the small company kind of an industry.
Okay, good. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for your indulgence, Ranking Member Larson. I think that might have even been one of your questions. So.
But I do have a few more. First off, I want to commend the panel for their comments on the Export-Import Bank. Obviously, it's important in Washington State, and it's very important beyond aviation manufacturing as well. And I can go through a myriad of examples in Washington State with companies with no relation to aviation that need Export-Import Bank because their local bank that lives on deposits has no idea how to do export financing. But they have these small businesses who increasingly have a lot of their business model dependent upon export. Mr. Cox, I do want to have a few questions for you. So, we've talked export-import and we've talked certification, all these very important roles that they play in supporting domestic aviation. But the workforce and workforce training is important, which is why we've asked you here. And I wanted to ask you kind of specifically, over these last 3 years, how has the demand signal for specific kinds of aviation work changed? Or are you still doing mainly maintenance or mainly assembly or mainly this or mainly that over the last 3 years?
Probably the most significant change that I think I've observed is in the area of composites technology. We've seen that. We started out knowing that it was going to be important, and it's kind of proven itself that is increasing in importance for what we train inside the project and for our workforce. So that would be the big change. We're probably seeing pretty stable as compared to before need for our aircraft, airframe and power plant mechanic side of things, general aviation specifically. However, there has been an increase in demand for assembly, for instance, with the major manufacturer Boeing as a great example. And then probably a smaller but growing piece that we identified early in the development process of our proposal to the DOL that has been a little bit surprising to me is the avionics and fiber optics piece. Now, we kind of, back in the day when myself and my 3 colleagues put this proposal together, we kind of looked at that and said, yeah, I think we can see something, a glimmer of something coming on the future or on the horizon. It turns out that there's a pretty significant demand for those 2 pieces of what we've been doing.
Yeah, right. I don't have the exact numbers with me, but we've looked at this in Washington State in terms of the supplier network and the percentage of work they provide to the major manufacturers of Boeing, Airbus, Embraer, and Bombardier. And when you add up the percentage of work, it adds up to over 100%. The point being that suppliers are not just supplying to one manufacturer in the state. They're supplying many of them to all 4, or a few of them to all 4, certainly many of them to at least 2 of the major manufacturers. So there's a real ecosystem of aviation manufacturing. in the state. Do you run into any issues with training for one company over the next, or is it generalized and you let then the employer do what they need to do with that employee that you provide?
Less so one company over another. I mean, we get fairly specific in assembly because that really is centric to the one company. However, in the other areas that are a focus of the project, we really are pretty diverse, I think, in the population of businesses that we serve. And something that you mentioned, I would also illustrate or highlight. One of the things we've seen as a indirect outcome of this project has been an increase in the number of companies in the state of Washington that have AS 9100 certification and now can get into the market of being suppliers to tier 1 suppliers or sub-tier 1 suppliers. All of that kind of gets us more into staying tuned into the general market and identifying where we might need specific or point issues addressed, whether it's a specific composites company or a specific avionics company. We can kind of dive into that on a local level, but that's the beauty of the project. The project is statewide, and it gives real flexibility to the 11 colleges that do this to kind of jump in and do point issue addressing rather than a one-size-fits-all kind of an approach.
Yeah, finally, I see my time's up, but if you indulge me, Mr. Chair, one more question for Mr. Cox. The subtitle of the hearing is Challenges and Opportunities. What's your number one challenge going forward, other than the grant runs out at the end of the year and you need to re-up it?
And even that is less of a challenge because, again, part of our winning strategy is the fact that the state of Washington, internal government, has picked up the mantle on this thing and is moving it forward with independent state funding to keep it going into the future. And that was never a requirement of the DOL as a continuation or sustainment piece. Our biggest challenge, I honestly think, is going to be in the navigator role. We have found that to be so important to building trust, building confidence in the businesses and industries that are going to work with us as higher education, and that is not built into our sustainability piece that the state is looking at. They're looking at sustaining our, basically our capacity expansion that we've created. So if I can figure a way out to get my navigators at my 11 colleges, and actually, quite frankly, it's larger than that, in our state, I would say that's our biggest challenge. Our win going forward is we've set a great example. We have, I think, in the case of this project, shown not only our state but nationally how to do one of these projects correctly. And I say that pretty humbly, actually, but I think it's very true. Our results are proof of that, and I think if anything, it'll give confidence to lawmakers like yourselves to positively consider those types of projects in the future and balance that against maybe some that aren't working so well.
Right, great. Good. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Dr. Bouchon?
Thank you. We've talked about the regulatory climate, but I want to just take this opportunity for your industry to discuss other impediments to American competitiveness in manufacturing. So, Mr. Bunce, I mean, you have any comments about maybe what your members think in the area of taxation and how maybe that's having some impact on your ability to be competitive? Or other issues, other than I think we've talked about the regulatory impediments, but there are other big issues right out there that are making American manufacturers not as competitive as they could be.
Absolutely, Mr. Bouchon. Something that we've been paying attention very closely is the accelerated depreciation or bonus depreciation issue that Congress just dealt with, so we were very gratified to see that. The R&D tax credit, huge for us. I think when you look at other nations out there and the amount of money that that they provide or incentivize their industry to do research and development for aviation absolutely is so essential to us. And anything that we can do to make that permanent, to be able to go and get folks to invest in R&D, that directly translates to new technology, new jobs out there. And then I think also from the non-taxation area, just also keeping pressure on the FAA to make sure that validation programs, as Mr. Brown mentioned, are very important. You know, obviously in Indiana, you've got a producer of engines that's a global producer. It's very important that nations that we have a bilateral relationship with, where we have recognized their competencies to be able to regulate, they've recognized ours, that's very efficient across the ocean, so that if they have a product coming in, that we don't waste a whole bunch of FAA resources looking at it, and vice versa, that if Mr. Brown's company were to go over there, that he very quickly can get his validation, because that delay in time to market has significant impact.
Ms. Blakey, you have any comments on anything to add on other impediments to American manufacturers?
Well, I would certainly foot stomp the R&D tax credit, which, of course, the House has supported and passed, but we desperately need that to be in place. Corporate tax reform is certainly a big part of what we would like to see. But let me turn to also the need for this body and the Congress as a whole to be supportive of areas where America's industry really does exceed. And I do have in mind the unmanned aircraft systems. You know, we sometimes get distracted by issues that surround these things when you're introducing new and disruptive technology. But this is an area right now where this country has an enormous lead, and we should look at it as something that is going to bring tremendous public benefit. And I'm talking about in all sorts of areas that really matter. You know, search and rescue, firefighting, public law enforcement. There's a lot to this. But when we realize that this technology right now, we actually could export as well as we could see it grow dramatically in this country. And we've got some pretty artificial clamps on introducing it into the NAS at this point, and also in being able to export. And we need your help and support. I'll be very straight up.
Thank you. Mr. Brown, you want to comment? I mean, you've obviously tried to have an export market. What do you see as some of the impediments out there? There are some obvious ones to American manufacturing. And I'll make these comments before I have you answer, because I'm very concerned about this. When you have companies in Indiana like Cook Medical Group that just need to expand and unfortunately have so many impediments that they decide not to expand in Indiana or neighboring states, that's a big problem. And, you know, we hear this all the time, that companies right now, as you know, are buying smaller foreign companies, and then, you know, the merged company will be based not in the United States. This is a growing trend. It's accelerating quickly because of our tax code. Your comments?
I think they've largely been made. I like your phrase, foot stomp. I'll foot stomp the validation issue. It's very, very significant to us, and I think putting it on the radar today sets the stage for more discussion during reauthorization. And I think the FAA would be very inclined to focus on the speed with which their TCs are validated, because eventually there's a quid pro quo. And so I think that they can be more demanding of foreign partners. I am a big fan of the R&D tax credit. I look at my income statement and I make investment decisions in part because I know that the government is incenting me to do that. Very important. I would add at a higher level, not just with export sales, but with all of my sales, it would help a lot if there was greater clarity in Washington rhetoric. In the past couple of years, there have been a number of times where what's going on here ends up in my conference room on Mondays with staff. Are we going to have an FAA during the sequester, or are they going to be shut down? Can we get type certificates out and validation support letters out, or not? Can my customer sell those 6 airplanes out of 7 with XM financing, or not? Are we going to do accelerated depreciation, or are we going to talk about jets as fat cat transport equipment? And I guess I would say somehow or another we've lost sight of the fundamental thing, which is that the U.S. aviation industry is winning. We are the world leaders. We generate a surplus in trade. We're the good guys.
I would agree with that. I just say I personally support XM, and I realize the importance to jobs in Indiana and in our country. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you. So we have a situation where we have the largest exporter in our country, the biggest net beneficiary to our balance of trade, and we are hamstringing it. If there are no further questions, I thank the witnesses for being here today and for your participation. This committee stands adjourned.